I am not going to bore you with Dan Brown novels, holy grails, or secret bloodlines of Christ. Because let's be honest, that's pop history cringe designed to sell paperbacks at an airport kiosk. If you want to believe 12 French knights found a magical cup in Jerusalem that gave them superpowers, you are on the wrong channel. We don't do vibes-based history here, we look at structure. The Templars weren't a group of Indiana Jones-style adventurers. They were a systemic response to a logistical crisis. To understand them, you don't need a map of secret tunnels. You need to understand how the medieval state failed to provide security and how a private entity stepped in to fill that vacuum. Let's start with reality. You imagine these guys as shining paragons of virtue, right? Like medieval superheroes in pristine white surcoats. The reality was much more pungent. When the order was formalized at the Council of Troyes in 1129, their biggest hype man and spiritual architect, Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, wrote their rule. Bernard was an ascetic who thought bathing was a gateway drug to worldly sin and vanity. He famously insisted that the knights should rarely wash, keep their hair short but their beards messy, and positively reek of holy sweat. This wasn't just because they were lazy. It was a deliberate rejection of the aristocratic chivalric lifestyle of the time. While secular knights were preening themselves, attending tournaments, and courting ladies, the Templars were busy being professional killers who lived like monks. Forget the shining armor. The original Templars were essentially heavily armed, incredibly wealthy religious hobos larping as monks in the blistering Levant heat. It was a grotesque aesthetic, but it was excellent marketing. In an age obsessed with performative piety, smelling terrible and looking miserable was a sign of total dedication to the cause. It gave them a moral high ground that no secular lord could match. They were grinding for the afterlife while everyone else was playing for land and titles. But here is the macro pivot. How did a bunch of unwashed, illiterate minor nobles become the most powerful institution outside the Vatican? It wasn't their tactical genius on the battlefield. Their combat record is actually quite mid if you look at the numbers. They lost more battles than they won toward the end. Their true god-tier skill was financial innovation. The Crusades had created a massive, unprecedented logistical nightmare. A European pilgrim or a minor noble from Champagne wanted to go to Jerusalem to get their sins absolved. Carrying physical gold coins all the way across the Balkans and Anatolia was basically asking to get murdered. You had to deal with Byzantine tax collectors who were professional scammers, Seljuk raiders who were professional archers, and local bandits who were just hungry. Enter the Templars. They realized that holding territory is expensive and politically messy, but managing the flow of capital is where the real power lies. They leveraged their international network of monasteries, called preceptories, to invent an early form of the letter of credit. You would deposit your gold at the Templar branch in Paris or London, and they would give you a coded, encrypted piece of parchment. You'd travel to the port of Acre or Jerusalem, present the parchment, and withdraw your funds in local currency. This was a revolutionary meta shift. It meant that for the first time since the Roman Empire, you could move wealth across borders without actually moving the physical metal. Of course, the Templars didn't do this for the vibes. They charged a hefty transaction fee disguised as an exchange rate cost. This wasn't just knighthood, this was Western Union with broadswords. They became Europe's first true multinational corporation. Because they were a religious order, they answered only to the Pope, meaning they were effectively immune from the taxes and laws of local kings. They were a state within a state, a decentralized autonomous organization before the term even existed. To understand why they were so successful, we have to look at the global context. While the Templars were building financial bridges between the Levant and Europe, the Italian maritime republics, Venice, Genoa, and Pisa, were busy doing the heavy lifting in terms of shipping. They were the Uber of the Crusades, brutally exploiting the religious fervor for commercial monopolies and trade warehouses in every port city. However, the Italians were seen as greedy, grubby merchants. They lacked clout. The Templars, on the other hand, had the ultimate PR cover. They were warrior monks. This allowed them to engage in usury, the lending of money at interest, which was technically a one-way ticket to hell according to church law. How did they get away with it? Through clever accounting gymnastics. They would label interest as rent on land, administration fees, or reimbursement for expenses. It was brilliant institutional hypocrisy. By the mid-13th century, they had become the primary bankers to the kings of Europe. If you were a king and you wanted to launch a crusade, build a massive Gothic cathedral to show off, or just fight your neighbor over a tiny patch of dirt, you went to the temple for a loan. Their Paris headquarters wasn't a barracks. It was the medieval equivalent of the Federal Reserve, but with more beards and better security. They held the royal jewels of England as collateral. They managed the entire French national treasury. They were the ultimate middlemen in a world that was becoming increasingly expensive to run. But the higher you climb the meta ladder, the more people want to ratio you. By the year 1300, the geopolitical landscape had shifted. The Crusader states in the Levant had finally collapsed. The city of Acre fell in 1291, and the Templars were forced to retreat to Cyprus. Suddenly, they had lost their race and debtor. They were a massive, heavily armed, ultra-wealthy financial institution sitting in the middle of Europe with no war left to fight. In the eyes of a modernizing monarch, an armed group that pays no taxes, answers to a foreign pope, and holds all your debt is not a holy ally. It's a massive security threat and a giant pile of cash waiting to be seized. Enter King Philip IV of France, known as Philip the Fair, though ironically his methods were anything but fair. Philip was a pioneer of the centralized state. He wanted to turn France from a loose collection of feudal lordships into a modern nation-state where the king's word was absolute law. But building a modern state requires two things: a bureaucracy and a lot of money. Philip was chronically broke. He had already tried to solve his debt issues by debasing the currency and expelling the Jews to seize their property, but it wasn't enough. His biggest creditor was the temple. Philip looked at his balance sheet and realized something that modern CEOs know all too well. It's often cheaper to liquidate your creditor than it is to pay them back. But you can't just arrest a holy order for no reason. You need a narrative. You need to gatekeep the moral high ground. On the morning of Friday the 13th, October 1307, Philip's agents conducted a coordinated dawn police raid across all of France. It was a masterclass in state-sponsored logistical precision. Thousands of Templars were arrested simultaneously. This wasn't a mystical event. It was a state crackdown on a non-state actor. To justify this, Philip's lawyers, the legists, manufactured a series of cringe accusations. They claimed the Templars spat on the cross during initiation, worshipped a mysterious cat head or idol named Baphomet, and engaged in ritualistic sodomy. Under the tender care of the Inquisition's torture devices, many knights confessed to things that were clearly absurd. If you torture someone long enough, they'll admit to being a lizard person from Mars. This was the first great state-sponsored smear campaign in Western history. The goal was to make the Templars look so horrific that no one, not even their fellow nobles, would dare defend them. The Pope at the time, Clement V, was a weak, sickly man who had moved the papacy to Avignon, effectively becoming a puppet of the French king. He tried to protect the order initially, but Philip threatened him with the same charges of heresy. Clement folded like a cheap suit. In 1312, the order was officially dissolved. Their assets were transferred to the Hospitallers, but in reality, much of the liquid wealth ended up in King Philip's pockets or was used to settle his massive debts. The final act was the burning of the last Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, in 1314. As he burned, the legend goes that he cursed the king and the Pope to meet him before God's tribunal within a year. And guess what? They both died within months. Pop history loves this curse, but the structural reality is more boring. The king was old, the Pope was sick, and the medieval state had successfully consumed its most powerful rival. The Templars didn't fall because of secret rituals or ancient magic. They fell because they were an obsolete feudal structure in a world that was rapidly modernizing towards centralized nation-states. They were the ultimate middlemen in an era where kings no longer wanted to share power or profits with anyone. They were an international bank in a world that was inventing nationalism. So the next time you see a YouTube video or a TV show about the secret treasures of the Templars, remember, their true treasure wasn't a golden cup or a map to Atlantis. It was a sophisticated system of credit, a global network of logistics, and an innovative approach to avoiding taxes. They weren't wizards, They were the first investment bankers of the West, and they got audited by a king who had a bigger army and no intention of paying his bills. In the end, the state always wins. Stay cynical.